Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you're signing in from today. I know it's a fairly international audience, actually, so appreciate everybody making time to join us today. Today, I'm joined by Mark Jarvis, Giga Metals CEO and Director for a town hall event. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm very good, Romeo. How are you?
Well, thank you. So today it's a town hall event, so we want it to be as interactive as possible. So the way today's going to work is first Mark's going to go through a very brief update, and then we'll go through some of the questions that came in advance over email. Hopefully we'll get to all of them, and then we'll go to live questions. So there's a chat button in the bottom right of your screen. You can use that to make a message at any time during today's event, and we'll hopefully be able to get to all of them. If for whatever reason we can't get to your question, I'll make sure that Mark and the Giga team get your email so that they're able to respond to that question at the end. So hopefully we'll be able to get to everything today. Should also say today's event is being recorded, as always, and will be available at 6.com and also on YouTube in the hours following today's event, likely by about 2 p.m. Eastern. It'll come right in your inbox if you're registered, but it'll be up on those platforms afterwards. That's enough housekeeping out of me. So I'm going to throw it to Mark for a brief update, and then I'll jump back on and go through some of those emailed in questions.
Okay, well, I guess the update is summed up by "May you live in interesting times." So, as you know, just to recount a bit of history, we came out with our PFS. We actually published it in October of 2023, and the nickel market proceeded to collapse. So that kind of, it did, throw a spanner in the works to some degree, it's made things more difficult, as it always does. The psychology shifts when the commodity price goes down, and that's kind of interesting. But we also recently completed a small equity financing, just to give ourselves a little more staying power. So what happened when nickel went down is some people we were talking to went away, and new people emerged. And so we are still having active conversations with potential strategic investors, talking about investing at the prospect level, or pardon me, at the project level. But again, some of them went away because of low prices and other reasons. So that's mostly what we're doing right now, in terms of looking for significant money, which we're not going to raise by selling equity in the company. Anyways, with that, let's open it up for questions.
Awesome. So there were a number that came in over email, so we will tackle those first. There's one that came in. Somebody said the EV car market's not growing near projections, and they wanted to know if the slowdown in EV adoption is in any way hurting advancement of developing Turnagain Giga's property. I know you sent me a slide, so I'll throw that up while you get started.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it depends what projections you were listening to, but EV sales are perceived to have slowed down, but they haven't slowed down. The rate of growth has slowed down. So, we had 10 years of, roughly 50% compound annual growth rate. It's mathematically impossible to sustain that. And there's more to it than that. But this slide on your right is from Macquarie, and it's EV adoption or EV growth from May of 2023 to May of 2024. And I've seen more recent figures that are actually higher than this, but that's a 13% growth rate worldwide. And that is a mix of LFP and nickel-rich chemistries. But with all of that considered, nickel demand growth for batteries alone is 13% a year. And then when you factor in and weight the growth in stainless steel, which is still the largest use of nickel, that growth is combined about 7% compound annual growth a year. That's a huge rate of growth. So, I mean, could the numbers be higher, and are people disappointed that they're not? I don't know, but I'm looking at that and going, that's a big demand growth rate. So, nickel is in oversupply as we speak today. But that demand growth rate, how long does it take to clear up the overhang? That's the question. And, timing, I can't give you. I just don't know the timing. So, and another element of it is that the car companies, like the legacy automakers, experienced a period of what I would call irrational exuberance. Everybody jumped into EVs at the same time. Everybody had huge plans. Everybody started pumping out EVs faster than they could be sold. And so now they've recoiled in horror. They've all lost a lot of money. And, I would characterize what's happening right now in that business as irrational fear. I mean, EVs, that story isn't going anywhere. And, it'll all, clear out over time. And, the growth rate is phenomenal. It will remain phenomenal, but it won't be at 50% compound annual growth rate. It just can't be mathematically.
That's the competing irrationalities of the market, but some things are true facts. So there you go. Yeah. There's another question that came in over email. And by the way, I see the comments in the chat. We definitely will get to those questions. Just want to get through these emailed ones first. Somebody asked, what's the outlook on funds to develop the mine at Turnagain?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if you look at the kind of money that we need to meaningfully advance this project, we're not going to raise that money by selling stock. Our price is too cheap. We'd basically have to give the whole project away to do that. We're not going to do that. We don't need to do that. If we have to be a little patient during the downturn, we'll be patient. We can survive. We can thrive. But the money to develop this project all the way to a final investment decision is probably somewhere between $40 and $50 million. And so, we're looking to sell pieces of the project at prices that will support project valuations that will support raising that kind of money. And, if we don't get our price, we're not going to do anything. So sooner or later, they have to come to us.
I know, it makes sense. Someone asked, and this is, it's a similar vein, but I think a little different formulation, so we can tackle it separately. Somebody asked, what's the plan to get the company past the PFS phase? So what are the next milestones people can look forward to?
Well, first of all, money. I mean, that's the first milestone. And so it's sort of like, we're in a funny time right now where it's sort of like nothing will happen, nothing, and then suddenly something big will happen. And I can't predict when. But I do know that the appetite is there. So, for example, before we had advanced discussions with a couple of different car manufacturers, and quite advanced. We were, to the point of starting to discuss terms. We've been through the due diligence, and then the price collapsed, and the car makers kind of got frightened. And so they went away. Mostly, I have to say that not all, but most of the strategics we're talking to now are mining companies. Mm-hmm. And so prices come down and they kind of come out of the woodwork and go, aha, prices are low. Good time to talk. So, that's what's going to happen. Nothing. And then all of a sudden something big will happen. I can't predict when it's going to happen.
Well, fair enough. It's interesting to hear who talks to you at different stages of the nickel price. So it's something curious. The next question is about kind of investigating a worst case scenario. They ask, if Giga can't find an investor to give $50 million soon, will you consider selling the company? What alternate strategy do you have, and what's the timeline on it?
Well, it's not our intention to sell the company in the near term. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I guess it bears saying is that we're a tiny company with one of the world's giant nickel deposits, and 1.9 billion US in capex is a pretty big hurdle. So it's likely that at some point, there will be mergers and acquisitions time, but that time isn't now, I hope, and we ultimately want the highest possible price for this asset.
Fair enough. Someone asked, have you signed up any new partners? I believe they mean strategic partners.
Well, if we had, you would know about it because there would be a press release and the stock would be doing something different than it's doing today. So
People like to ask, yeah. This is a pretty specific question about structure and strategy. Somebody asked, are you considering being listed on the NASDAQ or doing a reverse split to meet share price increase?
The answer to both is no. I mean, we're on the QX exchange, which performs all the functions that we need to have performed. The NASDAQ would be something for, if we have a lot larger market capitalization than we have today. And no, we're not considering a reverse split because there's no need to do that. And frankly, and I've got experience with this before, is, we've got roughly 110 million shares outstanding. And so when things get active, that's enough stock to provide lots of liquidity. So, if you're a larger player, you need that kind of liquidity to be able to buy and sell the stock without, causing big spikes in either direction. So I think our market capitalization is about right for right now for this stage of development.
Great. I know we have a couple more questions that came in on email, but there's a couple of very good questions in the chat. So I'm just going to jump and tackle a couple of those.
Sure.
Then we'll bounce back to some of the email ones. Rock asks from the chat, has there been any change in Mitsubishi's focus on the project?
No. And in fact, I made a trip to Japan recently, 3 weeks ago or something, to Tokyo. And I met with both the Battery Metals team, and I met with some people, higher up in the raw materials division, Mitsubishi Corp. And no, they're happy with our partnership. They're very happy with our partnership, actually, because we've got, there's myself, but there's also, Martin Vidra and Lyle Tritton. They're extremely experienced nickel people from an operating background. And, so the amount of information that they bring to the table, both on technical matters, but also on what's going on in the market from Martin's side, it's phenomenal. This is a top-notch team. It's small, but it's a really good team. And Mitsubishi recognizes that. Now, people have asked me, are they going to step in and provide money at this point? Nothing's changed there either. They put in the initial capital. They would like to see another partner involved before they increase their position. And so nothing's changed there, and they're prepared to be patient. And so in the meantime, we did that equity financing, which, is okay to, keep the motor running, if you will. But we will never raise enough money by selling stock to advance this project meaningfully. It's the next steps. I mean, the next steps I would like to do mostly revolve around the environmental assessment and community work to de-risk that part of it as effectively as we can. The next stages of engineering, I mean, our engineering is already quite detailed. And, there's stuff that will be optimized. There's things that will be sandpapered around the edges, but there's nothing big that's going to change in terms of our model here. We know what the footprint is. So, but that's the issue. We're a small company. We've got big money to spend to develop this.
Oh, makes sense. That's when I talk about Lyle. He's one of those guys I'm almost intimidated to talk to on events. I feel like I have to do readings before. He's so smart. There you go.
Well, it's funny because he's a very nice, soft-spoken, he's a very gentle person. But yeah, he's like too smart. And it's sort of like, it's hard not to feel,
I do my homework. I honestly do readings before I do it.
Yeah. No,
there you go.
Yeah.
Couple more questions from the chat. M. Babin asks, he'd like to know if the BC government will invest in the project and others in the EV market.
both the BC government and the Canadian government are really interested in developing critical minerals and being part of the supply chain for gigafactories, both in Canada and the US. And so, the federal government does have an infrastructure fund to support development of critical minerals projects. And by infrastructure, it's power lines and roads. And that's, in our PFS, our off-site infrastructure, power lines and roads, is about 170 million US. Now, the BC government, so 170 million US out of 1.9 billion is significant. And the BC government announced they're doing a feasibility study on running the power line all the way up the highway to the Yukon and connecting with the Yukon grid. This is a really smart idea. It's been around for a while. The Yukon has many potential power generation opportunities, including run of river, but also there's geothermal opportunities up there, and that's more of a baseline power load. So if you can have power coming in from the top of the system, it balances out the system and makes the system more robust. And so there's all sorts of opportunities that open up, for everybody, but including First Nations. There's some interesting potential power generation in First Nations territories up there that could be quite profitable. So, and so that would take care of about half of our capex for power lines, is if that ran all the way up to Dease Lake and through Dease Lake on up to the Yukon. But I believe that, beyond that, ultimately the government will pay for half or all of our remaining, costs for offline infrastructure or for off-site infrastructure. It doesn't happen till it happens, obviously, but the wind is blowing in that direction. Let me put it that way.
Oh, great. Appreciate that. Another question, this is from Joe Ferson in the chat, asks, what role do you think reductions in U.S. interest rates will play in garnering interest for investors?
Oh boy, a lower interest rate environment is good for capital projects.
Sure.
That's great. Now, beyond that, this project will have access to Japanese interest rates for at least some of the debt portion of building it. So, but nonetheless, just having lower interest rates in general is very helpful to big capital projects.
Great. Joe, if that doesn't answer your question, let us know in the chat. Speculanti asks, when would you prefer to do the feasibility study on the project? Would you wait for the new institution investor strategic partner to come in and ask them to finance the FS, or potentially do it in advance?
The answer is yes. We're looking for the money to go to full feasibility, which is, the reason it's going to cost money is we've got geotechnical drilling to do to support that. Mostly, there's other site work that we've got to do, but that's not cheap. The metallurgy and engineering that we have remaining to do isn't that big a deal, but it's still, it costs money. And then, the big item that people maybe forget about is that we've got to put this whole thing through an environmental assessment. Sure. So we're not going to really move forward meaningfully, I'm afraid, until we get that strategic investor and, to invest at the property level. It's just the way of the world. So that's the reality.
Nope, makes sense. Jump back to email questions. This is kind of a broad, crystal ball gazing kind of question. So answer just to the best of your ability. Somebody asked, when will nickel prices turn around?
Well, that's always the question, isn't
it?
Yeah. I just look at the compound annual growth rate of 7% for nickel in total. And, by the way, one of the reasons, some strategic investors like nickel is that it's not just EVs. It's EVs plus stainless steel, which continues to grow at slightly more than world GDP growth and off a huge base. So, it's perceived as less risky than, say, a pure lithium play, which really does depend on batteries. My hunch is sometime, in the next year or so, more or less, on some given Tuesday morning, the nickel price is going to take off because there'll be one more mine that closes. There'll be one event where suddenly people wake up and go, okay, it's tightening up again. And, bear in mind, I mean, at today's prices, 40% of producers are losing money. And so that's certainly all of the legacy producers where, you're talking about old mines where all the good stuff has been mined decades ago. And that's like BHP, for example, in Australia. They'll be shutting down. They announced that they would be shutting down in October. So coming right up, they'll be shutting down about 80,000 tons a year of nickel supply. I look at the Sudbury Basin and go, well, those mines are getting deeper and deeper and, more and more expensive to mine. But even Indonesia, which is, everybody thinks Indonesia is so cheap. It's not that cheap. And there's they cut every corner that can be cut environmentally, socially, and so forth. I mean, they cut the corners, but it's still there's Indonesian producers that are among the 40% in the world that are losing money, and you can't sustain that. And then, by the way, the grade in Indonesia just keeps dropping because, again, any mining jurisdiction, you take the best stuff first.
Sure.
and then as you keep mining, it's you're dealing with lower grades.
So you would think in Indonesia for the nastiness of some of those projects that it would be cheaper, but yeah, there you go. But in the same vein, actually, somebody reached out to ask via email if you think there's going to be an adjustment in how Canada, EU, US, and UK source their nickel by the time Turnagain goes into production. What's your best guess on any political changes there?
Well, it's already happening. I mean, the whole IRMA compliance movement in Europe. Gosh, don't ask me to tell you what IRMA means. But it's to do with ESG and environmental, sure. And with the carbon containment. And so if you don't comply, tariffs will go up. The US and Canada are imposing big tariffs on imported Chinese EVs because so much of that is state supported in one way or another. And so it's not fair competition. That's the perception. And I think just in general, I mean, the fact that the fact that I'm talking about this environmental assessment and the work we have to do with local First Nations. I mean, we've got supportive local First Nations, but that doesn't mean we've got a free pass. We've still got lots of work to do to let them know what our project looks like, let them know how the environment will be protected in the way that this whole project is designed. We have to do that work. In Indonesia, you don't have to do that work. And in fact, from an ESG perspective, it's not a desirable source. It is the source right now because they get these projects, permitted immediately almost. And so they are producing a lot of nickel and their percentage of world production has gone way up. But, if you want any environmental or social credentials at all, you have to get outside of Indonesia. And by the way, if you're making, in addition to everything else, very, very high carbon nickel, you can't just put up a few solar panels and go, okay, we're green now. They're still burning a ton of coal. They're still strip mining tropical rainforests. They're still dumping tailings in the ocean. I mean, you can't put a Band-Aid on it.
Fair enough. And that actually leads into someone sent in a triple barrel question. So I'll tackle them kind of one at a time. Okay. First is, any permitting problems potentially on the horizon for Turnagain?
We don't see any at this point. we don't see any deal killers. So no, but you have to go through the process, and you go through the process because maybe there's something that we haven't considered. But at this point, we don't see anything.
And as a follow-up to that, somebody looking like, what is the development timeline once the permitting process begins?
If you give me all the money I need today, I believe I can get the final investment decision 3 years from now, and we can start building this.
Great. And the last question, you've already touched on it, but I might as well ask it fulsomely, is they asked, are there any issues with local groups?
Not at this point. I mean, we've got relationships that we've established over, a long period of time. And we continue to work at that. And generally, the two First Nations that we deal with, the Tahltan and the Cascadena, are doing quite well in the mining business.
Sure.
And it's local work. A lot of the elders I talk to, when you talk to the elders, you're always going to find some that are against mining, full stop.
Sure.
But in my experience, they are the minority. Most of the elders like to have economic development in their area, in their territory, because they want the young people to grow up and stay there instead of move away. So communities that were shrinking are now growing, and it's largely thanks to mining.
Yeah, interesting. One question from the chat. Rock asks if you're doing any or plan to do any further drilling exploration on site at Turnagain in the foreseeable future.
We're taking a look at that. I've hired somebody, or I shouldn't say hired, engaged a consultant who is a world-class authority on nickel exploration, just to review our data. So, I can't say much more beyond that right now. We're just going through a data review. We haven't done serious exploration here for a long time. I mean, 15 years or so. And so, and we've got, we think about 25, or we've drilled less than 25% of what we think is prospective in this ultramafic system. And so, I just thought, let's get some fresh eyes on this, because there's two potential exploration targets. There could be high grade in here, and we've seen sniffs of high grade from time to time. One of the holes that happened just before I got involved, and it helped to propel me into the deal, was 20 meters of 1% nickel. And so it's sort of like, huh? In that particular area, we didn't find much more of that grade, but it can, you can get higher grade within the system, and we're taking a look at what the controls are on that. The other exploration target, so if you could find a small high grade mine, that could leverage everything off the ground. That would be awesome. And but the other target, frankly, is, have we found the best starter pit? Even if it's a similar style of mineralization, all you need is a little bit higher grade right at surface, and enough of it to mine for, say, 3 years or more. And that can change the economics as well. That can improve them quite remarkably. So, yeah, that's a really good question, because I like exploration, and but we've been really focused on development for like the last more than a decade. So we're taking another look, and stay tuned. We'll see what we come up with.
Awesome. Another question from the chat asking a broad question, but curious to your response. What sets your project apart from other nickel projects in the development phase right now?
Well, we are the only giant deposit. And when I say giant, I mean, projects that are capable of producing 35,000 tons a year of nickel for an extended mine life. So big projects. Of the undeveloped ones, certainly in Canada, of that scale, we are the only purely sulfide nickel deposit, which means a few things. I mean, FPX has an interesting project, but it's ferronickel. It's a where the projects in the east are a mix of sulfide nickel and iron, like they're basically nickel projects, but they're also iron projects. And so they're different. They're more complex. Our recoveries are amazing for this type of deposit. So 55% recoveries life of mine. That sounds low if you're coming from a copper world, but from the low-grade sulfide nickel world, that's an awesome recovery rate. Compares to recoveries in the low 40s for some of the eastern projects. Yeah, and the simplicity, like the fact that you're recovering one mineral, pentlandite. So it's just crush it, grind it, float the pentlandite, suppress everything else. Bob's your uncle. You're done. That simplicity translates into low technical risk. And I would venture to say that of the large undeveloped nickel projects in North America, we have the lowest technical risk.
Great, thanks. One question that came in on email during the event, they asked, do you see M&A heating up in the nickel world while prices are depressed, or do you think it'll spike when prices do?
Yeah, that's always a good question. I mean, if they were really smart, they would be buying everything when prices are low. But we've seen this cycle in the commodities business before, is that when prices get high and they're high sustainably, and and all the big companies are making money, they've got cash flow like you can't believe, because the price of gold's up, the price of copper's up, and their shareholders demand that they deploy their capital. Like, where's your project pipeline? Where's your growth going to come from? How do you differentiate yourself from your competitors? And so the CEOs go out and just start buying stuff. And some of that stuff turns out to be foolish. And then the commodity price comes down, the hangover hits, they're taking $1 billion, $3 billion write-downs here and there. The CEOs get fired. And then you've got another decade or more of more cautious CEOs who have replaced the CEOs that got fired for buying at the top. But will they buy at the bottom? Or are they too cautious? Right? It's a good question, and I just can't definitively answer it.
Makes sense. Funny to see that cycle of CEO styles, but you certainly do decade after decade. So it's kind of funny to see.
Every time.
Yep. There's one question that came in, somebody asking about General Motors investing $250 million into Lithium Americas to vertically integrate for lithium. They're asking if you see things like this happening in nickel in the future, or you think that's going to be specific to lithium?
Well, I don't know. I think it should be happening in nickel. If I was a car company and I knew everything I know about, the nickel world, I would be investing upstream. So I think that's a smart move that General Motors made, and I see that their production of EVs and their sales of EVs are growing. They're actually quietly creeping up on everyone. So GM's going to be an interesting story to follow. I do think that for the long term, I mean, lithium is an oversupply right now, just like nickel is. And in fact, it's a smaller market. So the oversupply, I think, is going to take longer to clear than the nickel oversupply. But it will clear. I mean, 10 years out, who knows where we're going to sit. And so it's good for the car companies. It's smart, I think, for them to be securing upstream supply. And by the way, I think the model should be the Mitsubishi model, where they become a joint venture partner, a minority joint venture partner. They don't want to build the mine. They don't want to operate the mine, just like Mitsubishi doesn't want to build or operate, but they want their share of the offtake at the cost of production. And so in our case, that cost of production is going to be steady over decades. It's going to be remarkably non-volatile, because we would be using long-term power contracts, for one thing. That's a big one. energy is a huge part of your OpEx. You know, and getting it from a trusted source. So, you know, if you're in a Canadian project, any Canadian project, you're getting your materials from something that's been through a rigorous environmental assessment, and which complies with, you know, all of the ESG considerations around, you know, dealing with Indigenous people and so forth. I mean, it's clean nickel, and in our case, and in fact in other cases in Canada, it's very low carbon nickel, and possibly carbon neutral nickel. So all of that long term is something to consider. Whether it matters, you know, in a meaningful way today, you know, that's more debatable.
Awesome. Well, Mark, we're through the questions that we got sent in. Really, thanks so much, Sinead. I think this is a really interesting conversation. I'll throw it to you for a last word before we wrap it up for today.
Well, I guess it's interesting right now because, you know, we're clearly at the bottom of the market for nickel, and I say that because 40% of producers are losing money, and you know, nickel can bobble this way and that a little bit as it scrapes along the bottom. But if you've got 40% of producers losing money, that's the bottom. So how long does the bottom last, and all of that? And our project is very levered to the price of nickel, and so, you know, if you're patient, and you have to be patient in the junior resource business, and this is what I do. Like I'm a punter myself. I've got a portfolio of nickel stocks, and what you do is you try and buy the lows and accumulate, and then this is what I do. I put them away and don't think about them for a while. As long as I like management, and as long as I don't think the company's going to go bust, and as long as I think the project has merit, I'll just put it away and wait. And maybe 6 months later, maybe 4 years later, I'll wake up one morning and suddenly things are happening, and I'm like glad I've already got a position because I wouldn't want to be chasing it now. That's the way the market works, and it does require patience, and it does require the courage to buy when you're at the bottom of the cycle. So I'll leave you with that.
Definitely some wisdom there. So Mark, thank you so much. And obviously everybody who joined us, thank you. You receive the replay as soon as possible. And if you think of the perfect question to ask right after the event ends, as I usually do, we'll make sure to get back to you. So please do still reach out with that question. We'll get the Giga team to respond as quickly as possible. But everybody, thank you so much, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much, Romeo, and thanks to everyone for attending.